Hi. So I made a video, I think it was at the very beginning of December, where I talked about my reading goals for, or my plan, which books I planned on reading for December. And now I'm going to talk about which books I actually managed to read for the last part of December, because I have already on the 16th of December, I had a video where I talked about which books I've read up until then. As usual, I am not very good at sticking to plans when it comes to reading, so I didn't stick to my reading plan. That being said, December was actually a really good reading month for me. I got to read quite a lot of what I planned to read. However, there were a couple of books I had hoped to read in December that I wasn't able to. As I've talked about before, I fell ill in December, and even though I did manage to get quite a bit of reading done, I have felt quite tired at times and haven't really had the energy to read as much as I hoped. I had hoped to read a lot more, but with all the travel, my partner and we went to Ireland to celebrate Christmas because he's Irish. And my previous video was actually a sort of a book haul, so you can check that out if you're interested. Anyway, but that's it. I'm not going to talk anymore about plans or what I've done, other than I'm going to do a sum up for what I've read since the 16th of December, when I last summed up my reading. So it's kind of a wrap up, I guess, but just for half of the month. So the first book that I read after my previous wrap up was this book, Else går till psykolog. Else goes to a psychologist. It's written by Else Kåss Furuseth. And it's a non-fiction book, and it's kind of a book of conversation between her and her psychologist. Excuse me. So I thought it was a really, really interesting book. She starts going to see the psychologist because she lost both her brother and her mother to suicide. And she's kind of having a lot of thoughts. So the book is kind of the conversation she has with a psychologist over a 2-year period. And I found it to be really, really, really interesting to see. Not only you get like an insight to how it's actually, what it is like to go to a psychologist, but it's also talks about like what we think about ourselves, how we judge ourselves, and yeah, and also it makes it kind of not as scary to go to a psychologist. I don't know about other countries, but I think in Norway it has been quite taboo to talk about such things, and she's done a lot about lifting it into the daylight about like mental health issues, and I thought that was really, really interesting. And for those of you who doesn't know, Else Kåss Furuseth is a quite well-known person in Norway. She's a comedian. She does a lot of stand-up. She's also made like a stand-up show, I think, about the brother. So I really, really enjoyed this book. So that was the first book I read after the 16th of December. The next book was this book, Leons Hemmelighet. It's probably quite hard to see. It's written by Tor Fredheim, and it's a young adult book. It has an LGBTQ plus theme. It's a young boy, and he is gay, and he keeps it secret from his family. And he falls in love with this other boy, and the boy loves him, or is in love with him back. and he's also kind of been hiding, but I think he's kind of out as well. It's very hard to explain. It's a very, very thin book. And I tend to really like Tor Fretheim because his writing is so beautiful. But this book, I liked it. It's not that I didn't like it, but I kind of wish there was more to it, especially since it has an LGBTQ plus theme, and I think we need more LGBTQ plus theme books for young adults in general. So quite liked it. But yeah, I wish there kind of was, it was a little bit longer. And I think it is one of the last books he wrote. He passed away, was it a couple of years ago? Or last year? 2018 maybe? Can't remember. Time, not my thing. But yeah, enjoyed it, but I wish it was longer. And then I've read a lot of Norwegian books, I just have to say. I've read a lot of Norwegian books. That's probably why December was such a good reading month for me, because I read a lot of Norwegian books. So the next book up is Vintertoner of Anders Totland, by Anders Totland. That was a bit of Norwegian sneaking in there. And I am so pleased that I read this around Christmas, because it can actually be called a Christmas-themed book, in a way. At least a lot of it is like leading up to Christmas, and is also around Christmas time. So it's like in the very beginning of winter-ish sort of thing, which is like the time we are just left. So I think it's like very clear that it's set in Western, excuse me, Western Norway. I think it's like places has not been named, but from what I can see, I think it's maybe Bergen is like the city that he lives in, and then it's an island outside somewhere that he's from. And it's about this young man. He's a writer, and he's left the farm where he grew up with his mom. They moved away from his dad, and he has this picture of why they moved, and there was a lot of secrecy, and they left when he was 16, I think, or was he younger? To be honest, I can't quite remember. 15, 16, early teens, thereabouts. And then he goes back. He gets a phone call from his sister's husband, telling him to come home. And he goes home, and he's kind of has this plan of writing about his mom. And then he goes back, and he doesn't really want to go back, I think, but he feels like as if he has to. And then after a while, it turns out that things aren't quite as he thought they were. So that was quite interesting. So it's one of those books that is about like leaving home and then coming back home, and also about that reality might not always be as we think, and the story has more than one side. And yeah, it's beautifully written, really beautifully written. The language is amazing, but it also really, really interesting book to read. I really, really enjoyed it. So I got this from, I kind of got this from the publisher, but I got this in a goodie bag kind of thing. So I haven't quite decided whether I should kind of book cross it, because it's a really good book. But I also might reread it, maybe at some point. Not quite sure. I'll see. I'm hanging on to it a little bit longer. And then I read this book by one of my favorite Norwegian authors, Tor Åge Bringsær. And this is kind of funny, but it's not the first time he has a long title of one of his books. But this is one of the books that has a long title, so I have to read it. Ikke fordi den har et svar, men fordi den har en sang. Not because it has an answer, but because it has a song. I think the title is amazing. It's beautiful. So it's very hard to talk about this book in many ways. And the reason for that is that it's set in a world, so it's kind of fantasy, I guess. And I think a lot of people will kind of shy away from it because it's fantasy, but it's so human. This book is so human. But I think it's kind of it's interesting because you can kind of see. I find it so hard to talk about this book. It's set in a world, and you have regular humans, and then you have another race. They have tails, and they are kind of and they have fur, so they're kind of like animals, non-human animals. But at the same time, they're also very intelligent and they can speak, so they're also kind of like humans. So they're kind of like an in-between thing. So this book is very much about the differences between humans and animals, how we treat each other, but you can kind of also see it as something bigger, like apartheid. You can still read it as that, actually, like the differences between, like humans, how we treat each other, how we look at people who are different from us. So this is a really good read. I really enjoyed it, and Tor Åge Bringsværd, he's one of my favorite Norwegian authors. It's the brilliant book. But that was the last book in Norwegian, and I only read one more book last year, and that was an ebook that I have. It's A Desert Song by Amy M. Young. And my cover picture is actually different from the regular version, because I got an art from the author. I have to say that Amy is a friend of mine. I care for her. So of course, when I got a book from her, I was kind of nervous to read it, as I usually am when I know someone who's written a book that I'm going to read. I got an ARC, advanced reader's copy, and it took me ages for some reasons. I don't know why. I think it's the just other books coming in between. It wouldn't be a book that I normally would have picked up, because it's kind of a romance, but it's still not what I would think of as a typical romance. Romance. It's such a strange word. I struggle with that word. It probably says how much I read that sort of thing. The other thing about this book, though, it's not just that, because you have another thing happening here, and it's about a sort of a religious sect. It's set in the 80s, which explains a lot. I think it's 80s, if I'm not mistaken. 80s, early 90s? I can't remember. But yeah. So they don't have like mobile phones and stuff like that. And there's this guy, and he's on his way from something. It's like the first part of this book is so long I read it. I don't really remember all that much, all the details. But it's not really important. The thing is, he drove from somewhere, and I can't remember where he was going, but he ended up at this motel. or what he thought was a motel. And he kind of checks in for the night, and when he tries to leave in the next day, he can't. And it's kind of this sect, and he's kind of drawn into that. And he meets someone who he gets to know. And they kind of get very attracted to, so they have a lot of like things in common and things. So yeah, so it's kind of, even though it's like a romance, it also has a lot of suspense. So especially at the end of the book, I found it very hard to put down. And I think if it wasn't for all these other books that I had to read for like work or something like that, I probably use less time on this. But I quite enjoyed it. Excuse me. So yeah, so it's the first book in a series, or maybe it's a trilogy. I'm not quite sure. The second book is not out yet. I think Amy is writing it, though. I think she said she was writing it. So that was my last book of 2019. So that's it for now. I will come back to you with a sum up of 2019 and goals for 2020 in my next video. Until then, goodbye.